Hello everybody, my name is Rowan Darwick from ABC Radio and I'm facilitating this Q&A session this afternoon, which is about the changing climate, challenges and opportunities for Central Australia. And I hope that everybody's been thinking of some questions that they can put to this panel, because we have some very, very wise and intelligent people who are very keen to share their thoughts with you this afternoon. So if you've got anything that's related to living where we live and the conditions here in the environment here and the changing climate, then make sure you pick their brain. We've got a roving mic and somebody will be in charge of that, possibly Jimmy, possibly somebody else. So when we get into that part of the discussion, just raise your hand and we'll bring the mic to you. And when we do bring the mic to you, if you can say your name before your question would be a good thing. And also if you're, oh yeah, the mic will be travelling around there, thank you. And if you're associated with any sort of major organisation in town that you want to give us that extra information as well, that's good. Our panel this afternoon, starting from my left, your right, is Lyndon Frearson with CAP Projects. Anthea Fawcett is next to him from the Remote Indigenous Gardens Network. Harold Ferber is next to Anthea from the Desert Peoples Centre and also the Deputy Chair of Desert Knowledge Australia. I'm not sure who this chap is, but we should hopefully work out who he is. You can just refer to him as Loud Shirt, that's fine. And we have Veronica Dobson on my right, Eastern Arundel Senior, and also Dr. Mark Stafford-Smith from CSIRO. So please welcome our panel this afternoon. And we're going to start our discussions this afternoon by giving each of our panellists just a couple of minutes to talk about their vision for a sustainable Central Australia, or indeed Australia, broadening it out in that way. So just looking at sustainability, looking at how we use our water, how we use our power, and where each of our panellists think that the future lies. So Lyndon, do you want to start and put you in the hot seat and just talk about your vision for how you see our area?
Rightio. Well, I guess as an electrical engineer, you won't be surprised to find that my views are very heavily skewed towards both an understanding of electricity and a very sort of technically what it means for us in sort of 20 or 30 years' time. One of the things that's not commonly understood by many of the people around Australia who are currently commenting on the climate change debate and carbon tax and stuff like that, that when they talk about renewable energy and different types of energy, they will, and Alan Jones is probably a prime example of this, will talk about the fact the sun doesn't shine at night, that there's clouds and there's things like that, and they make these pronouncements as sort of solemn judgments upon high, like we've never worked that out. But just to give you a bit of order of understanding, with today's technology utilising standard PV panels that some of you will have on your house right now, if we built a solar field the same as the one that's out at Uturno, of only about 35 kilometres by 35 kilometres, so not absolutely massive, but 35 kilometres by 35 kilometres, that would produce enough energy for the entirety of Australia for all of its needs each year. So that's just using today's technology. Now, yes, we need to manage storage, we need to manage intermittency, but there's a whole bunch of technologies that are coming that and are being researched, some of them right here in Central Australia, that are actually allowing those things to be resolved. The core thing to understand about what we look to in the future is to not necessarily constrained by our understanding of the past or being constrained by our understanding of past technologies. And I think very much, as someone who trained to be a power engineer in the coal sector and then worked in the car manufacturing business for a long time, we've got an energy system, even here in Alice Springs, that has been very finely tuned over the last 100 years, and we've got really good at making things work the way they've always worked. The vision for the future is not so much, I guess is not so much just about the technology, it's about recognising that there's just a whole bunch of different ways of doing it. And so thinking about how we consume water differently and recognising that water in Alice Springs, every kilolitre of water uses a kilowatt hour of energy, and that we'll see figures like that more and more around other parts of Australia, starts to give you a different understanding of how you can manage energy consumption by changing patterns of water use and household management. And I think those are the types of things that are going to change over the next 20 to 30 years, but it will actually require an entire systemic change to how we approach energy. And I guess that's the bit, other people will talk about all sorts of other elements within society, but that's the bit that I guess I'm a bit more focused on.
Thanks, Lyndon. Anthea, what's your vision for sustainable Central Australia or broadly more Australia?
Oh gosh, well I'm a bit overwhelmed because, after Dr. Carl's presentation you don't know whether to go macro or, focus in on something really fabulous and tiny that you can do with finitude that you can get your head around and actually really deliver on. I suppose I've worked in the sustainability scene for about 25 years and I have, including quite a long time in the renewable energy sector and the engineering sector. And the more you get, when you look at the hard science, it can be really, really depressing. And that big picture story makes it very hard to get a grip on what you can do and stay mobilised and motivated. So in terms of my vision, I just sort of want to just make a few prefacing comments and then try to sort of focus in on some really practical things that RIG Network members, many of whom are here today, and lots of communities around the country are sort of looking at. I really picked up on, in particular, I really loved the fact that you can compare apples and oranges, particularly through the infrared radiation. I'll be using that a lot in the future. That's fantastic. But what Dr. Carl was saying about, that politicians are really cheap to buy at the moment, and I think, we're really at a crazily critical moment at the moment. Australia's got this weird resources curse, and, I'm sure many of you have different takes on what the resources curse is. But obviously in the Australian context at the moment, our politicians and the public imaginary just can't get its head away from the mining industry, and that is what our economy almost means. And that's a real problem. So I think there's a real challenge there. My vision would be for people to be able to think and talk about public issues in a really different way. And my interest is food and food security and food sovereignty. But I think the parallel with mining, and there's a real coupling between the dominance of mining and our food futures at the moment, which needs to be really interrogated and local action taken around. So that's sort of my big picture comment. And now's a really exciting time to be thinking food and food systems holistically, sustainably, and in really different ways, because there is a national food plan being developed for the first time in Australia. For obvious reasons, it's being framed in an agribusiness, mainstream business as usual type model, but it's a big, complex system, and so of course the government has to start somewhere. I think there's some great stuff in the green paper. I encourage everyone to read it and contribute to it, and it's good because it's opening up the discourse around what are the sorts of futures we want that are more sustainable. And ironically, we haven't had any strategic discussion about land use and mining in this country. It's just happened. The horse has just bolted. And luckily we've got a mining tax, but it's not probably going to rein it in that much. But ironically, the food plan's actually bringing together a whole lot of issues, strategic issues, around foreign ownership, around land use, around water, around obesity, around the pandemic of diabetes. It's bringing together a whole range of issues that I think probably a lot of us here care about. So that's kind of, one big thing that frames my vision in some ways. A heads up about why we should all become politicians. I got into the renewable energy sector within about a month of John Howard being elected. And why did I go into the renewable energy sector? It was because the first thing John Howard did was to axe the ERDC, which was the Energy Research and Development Corporation. And this was in the mid-90s. And it really just put the kibosh, put the stopper on some really innovative projects, many of which had already listed on the market, one of which was called Sustainable Technologies Australia, which was developing smart windows and titanium solar cells. And, they just killed that company. It's now gone back to Switzerland. They're still here, but anyway, point being, first thing John Howard did was to axe innovative energy action. First thing Tony Abbott will do, I think he probably will take the carbon tax back. And the flip side of Tony Abbott is that he will be saying that the solution to climate change is to plant more trees. Of course we should all be planting more trees, but it's not the scale and the mode of action that we need. So I'm just prefacing the Tony Abbott lead-in of the issue around trees, because what I want to talk about in terms of practical terms for my vision perhaps for this area, and I wouldn't presume to have a vision for this area, there are many dignified people on this panel far better positioned to presume to go near that question, but is what are some of the really visceral lived impacts of climate change in areas like this and across the top end? It's going to be a lot hotter, and there's going to be many more days. I think there, a conservative estimate is that it's going to be 9 to 26 more days per year that are 35 degrees or greater. And it's at 35 degrees that public health really profound negative impacts kick in for vulnerable people, for young people, for old people, for sick people. The issue around, there's going to be a lot more heat, it's going to be a lot drier often, and then you will still have these crazy big rains. So how do you think about nimble food systems that can adapt and be flexible and that can work with partnerships in really interesting cooperative new ways? It's not, we've got to think really cleverly about what the local food system is and how we can develop social enterprise and commercial enterprises within that sort of framework and do things at a really small micro level, whether it's community gardens or household gardens and that sort of thing. And we need to be really forward-looking and not dwell on the negative things of the past. And there's a huge history of problematic projects in Central Australia around food, and that all needs to be taken apart, which we'll be doing on Monday, I believe. And then for the top end Australia, 1 metre of sea level rise, it's going to be, I went to a climate change symposium in Darwin last year, and the impact of 1 metre sea level rise in the top end, and the sea level rise is greater, and Dr. Carr will know more about this for the different oceans, but the rate of sea level rise across top end Australia is much greater than perhaps on southeast Australia. And 1 metre sea rise is going to have profound impacts for all the mangroves, the estuaries, the rivers, the catchments, devastating effects for biodiversity. Kakadu will go, they're talking about what to dam and what to preserve as a museum already. That's pretty shocking, And for Central Australia, in the last few years we've had this amazing experience of these big rains, and we've possibly got a bit complacent, but you've seen the devastating impacts of the big rains, the big greens, and then the devastating fires, so that biodiversity loss, huge. Okay, so my quick vision is for every household to plant at least 2 more shade trees, 2 more fruit trees, and we need massive, really well-considered urban community, homeland, household greening for shade, food, biodiversity, for more resilient local systems. Yeah.
Right. Thanks, Anthea. Harold, what's your vision for a sustainable Central Australia?
First of all, I'm not a scientist. I've got other expertise. Look, first of all, I think that we need to come to grips with the fact that all the experts tell us that there is this change happening. That this change is happening, and that let's get real about it. First Nations people across north, across the Arctic and so forth, can see it firsthand. What they say is that the change is happening, the ice is melting, there is change happening. So that's good enough for me, apart from the scientists telling us the same thing. For me to accept that there is change happening. That's number one, we need to accept it. The other thing is that the flexibility of particularly our region, but droughts, flooding, rains. I won't go into too much more detail. I think that was explained a bit from the last speaker, that the change is likely to happen, that we're likely to get more intense flooding. The cyclones up north are likely to be more severe, and therefore probably head inland towards Central Australia a lot more, and more of those heavy rains that come with it. But at the same time, it's predicted, I understand it, to be hotter here, warmer here, so there will be that change happening. How long over a longer period, I'm not sure, but obviously it'll be some time to come. But here in Central Australia, we need to I guess, work towards these things happening, and I guess in some ways that's what we are doing with these sort of discussions. So whatever government gets in, we need to convince them that things are happening, that change is happening. Central Australian challenges, I think we've got the issues of remote Australia, sparse populations, less political power, if you like. The power resides in the capital cities. It's what do we do out here? It's trying to convince the population in the capital cities and the politicians that what's required for, I guess, the majority of the land mass, where most people don't reside, but where we reside. So that's one of the challenges we have in remote Australia, particularly in Desert Australia, in Northern Australia, is trying to convince politicians through the people about the need to prepare for these changes and just what to do. It is real, it is happening. We in Central Australia, I guess, setting up the Desert Knowledge Precinct and Desert Knowledge Movement is part of that change, as I see it. It's preparing things for the future, whatever directions might go. It's bringing expertise here into the centre to discuss these matters, to work out ways we can move forward. We have to do it interculturally. We have to do it together. It's a reality. We need to do it. We do it here, and we have to do it. Unlike, to a certain extent, most capital city people, they can live their own lives free from diverse from some of the problems that we have out in the bush. But we need to. We will be working together. We are working together, and these are the challenges that we have in front of us, and we have to do it as a group, as a people across remote Australia. Which brings me to the next point, is that the colonial boundaries that exist across the desert, they're invisible. They mean nothing in reality to camels or to Indigenous people. So these matters of these colonial boundaries and the jurisdictional arguments that occur on a daily basis needs to be challenged. And how do we tackle these issues on a global and a national level? Because that's what they are. And I guess that's where I'm coming from, is that governance in Australia, the governing of Australia and the governance of it needs to be looked at and challenged as to how we can do this on a national level and take into consideration our global responsibilities. And I see Alice Springs, due to its particular location, iconicness, both as Aboriginal and as an outback town, as possibly becoming a centre of excellence for ongoing discussion on climate change and particularly how it might affect remote and desert areas. So I see Alice Springs as becoming the centre. There will be less dependence on tourism. These are figures that are coming out over the recent years, and Alice Springs becoming more of a hub centre, service centre for remote Australia. And that's a local thing as I see it happening. That's in spite of the climate change.
Thanks very much, Harold. Dr. Carl,
I've
your sustainable vision.
given it before in the talk, which gives me an advantage. So the whole hour and a quarter is it, right? Second bit, I'm just going to follow on from what Harold said, which Anthea and Linda have said. We're talking about the future. I remember being involved with some demonstrations about wood chipping, and I tried to understand what was going on, and I talked to both sides, and they both wanted the same thing. They wanted their grandchildren to be able to have an income and a life and a place to live. And yet, one bunch wanted to chop down all the trees immediately and have nothing left, and the other bunch didn't want to chop down anything ever. And yet they both wanted the same thing. And so once we worked out that they both wanted the same thing, then we could come up with a compromise. We've just got to work out what we want and then head towards it on personal, government and business level. That's it.
Thank you. Veronica, what's your vision for sustainable Central Australia?
Well, I didn't sort of really think that I was going to be up here talking about, didn't have anything written up, so
That's all right.
no, I just talk about what happened out on country, like with different groups, different language groups. Out at Santa Teresa, we worked on the waters out there, the springs. They were polluted by cattle, and they were a source of water for our people for 60,000 years, and they were destroyed by cattle and feral animals. And that's the type of thing I thought was going to be talked about today, but, you know,
I'm sure it will be.
I
Yeah.
didn't have anything written up,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, well, I guess your sustainable vision might be returning to the days where you can access water like that and it's not polluted.
Yeah, well, you know, waters, that was important to our people. When our people worked on cattle stations and that, and they went back to look after their waters and sites and land and what was on the land. European people that they worked for used to say that they went walkabout. They never went walkabout, they went back home to do the job duties on the land. And they see the environment being wrecked by cattle, by, you know, feral animals like horses, camels, and a lot of that type of stuff is a lot of bother to my people because they had chores to do when they went back after working cattle stations, and now that they've been put on communities and missions and places like that, they can't go back to do their duties to look after their waters, their sites and plants and what's on the land and the land itself, and the land gets wrecked as well. I might as well just talk about that stuff rather than
We absolutely will.
And also the environment changes. They see it every minute of the day. They don't just jump up and down when it's too far gone. It's, you know, my people see it happening every minute of the day, little by little, but it does happen. And then when it gets bigger, people are sort of saying, oh, you know, the environment changes and whatnot's happening, we need to do something about it. So I'm sorry to sort of say that in that way, but you know, this is the way we've always lived and cared for the country, but a lot of the country has been taken over by cattle stations and that, and people can't go back to it, so you know, their waters and that are destroyed by cattle and other animals like camels and that. And there is a couple of DVDs that were made by groups of people that did the indigenous knowledge stuff that's on the TV. I did give one to one of the guys here, and we only got them yesterday. If you need to, you can sort of find out from Land Council. That's where you can get those DVDs, these different groups working on the land with waters and the environment. These are Aboriginal people. We do work, Aboriginal people do. The information that's given for the IECO work, the Indigenous knowledge work, is from Aboriginal groups all over Alice Springs here. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Veronica. Mark, to you. What's your vision for a sustainable Central Australia?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I wouldn't mind starting a bit broad and coming back actually to some of the points that Veronica was just making, because they sort of illustrate, I think, a whole lot of the things that we need to worry about. I have to say I'm still reeling slightly from the vision of Dr. Carl getting his haircut done by a plumber, so, which I obviously haven't done for the last little while. But if you actually step out to the very broad level just for a minute, I think one of the first things to realise is just how significant and important it is actually that we do manage to find ways ahead in places like Alice Springs. I've always seen it in terms of at the real global level, just the urbanising trends that are happening around the world. As many of you know, more than half of the world's population was living in cities from a couple of years ago. And that's a trend which is rapidly extending. And in fact, if you look at the arid areas of the world, or the areas that we share some things in common with, which is about 40% of the world's land surface and a couple of billion people living there, those regions are heading towards 70 to 80% urbanisation over the next 40 or 50 years. And so in fact, if we can't manage to get the way of operating which allows a place like Alice Springs and all the indigenous knowledge and all the living on the land around places like this, if we can't work out how to make that work and interface properly with the cities here in Australia, where of course we're well ahead of that global trend, then we've got a real problem coming worldwide. So it's really actually very significant to try and work through those issues. And they pick up things that almost everyone's said here about how one lives in this environment, but also how one lives together in it, the sort of social dimensions of intercultural activities and so on. But also how we live together with our cities, how we actually make sure that those cities appreciate what's happening out here, that we don't just have sort of mining imposed on particular areas because it's got power in the cities, but it doesn't flow back to resources coming back out here to look after these environments, things like that. Those sorts of governance issues that Harold mentioned are really profoundly important. So firstly, I just want to say we've got a really significant issue here, and no one should underrate the value of coming to some solutions in a region like this. The second, I want to make 3 points. The second point I want to do is just to pick up a bit the climate change things in particular, and talk perhaps a bit more about the adaptation to climate as opposed to the mitigation side. So there's lots we can be doing on the mitigation side, but as we know, we need a lot of people to be doing that, and we need things like a price on carbon to make it possible for everyone to engage in that. But on the adaptation side, Anthony's already mentioned that, clearly there are going to be things like heat waves which matter, although I'm struggling a little bit to think about heat waves at the moment. But in a broad sense, there's direct effects of climate change, things like heat waves and potentially more extreme flooding here, as Harold mentioned, are the sorts of major impacts we might get here in central Australia, not sea level rise, fortunately. Then there are indirect effects, and the sort of key indirect effects, I think, are going to be effects on our vegetation and biota, which flow through to impacts on things like bush foods and the way people culturally value this landscape, but also the opportunities for gardens and things like that. And then there's a whole suite of slightly more indirect effects, which are probably going to be the biggest ones for us, which are the effects of things like increasing fuel prices and energy prices if we don't sort of take action to alleviate that. And against each of those, you can think about things which you do. This is my second point. You can think about things which you do, which are sort of short-term, reactive, and just fix it up in the short term. And if you can imagine a heat wave here for a moment, you can obviously just stick in more air conditioning, which of course means you're using pumping more carbon dioxide out into the atmosphere. So it's got that sort of problem. But also, it actually makes you more vulnerable in the future, because if energy prices go higher, it becomes less easy to do that. If the power grid fails or something like that, then you're actually more vulnerable. So comparing those short-term activities or responses with longer-term ones, which are more about trying to build the resilience of our society, which might be, of course, improved housing designs and things like that. It might be improved health, just so that we're actually more able to cope with those extreme temperatures at times. It could be a whole variety of things like that. And thinking about that through all of those adaptation areas. So just to pick up another one, fuel prices. Obviously you can argue just to subsidise fuel prices out here in remote areas, but that's a pretty short-term sort of solution really, and you've only got to have a government that comes in and disagrees and you lose it again, and you actually become more vulnerable in the future. So thinking about enterprises or activities that don't need so much transport, thinking about different modes of transport which might use less energy anyway, building obviously the sort of local grids and things like that give you different ways which are much more aimed at resilience, long-term solutions, and sometimes transformative change in what we do. So the second point I want to make is just this avoiding short-termism in our responses to all of these things, really trying to think through what are the longer-term, more strategic, more proactive activities we can take on. And the third one, won't go on much longer, but the third one was just to come back to, in all of those things, trying to focus on the things that we've got the potential to be good at, where we've got the comparative advantages of doing things. So, do we have a comparative advantage of making bricks here and selling them to Sydney? Well, no, it's not a very good thing to do for a whole variety of reasons. Do we have a comparative advantage in understanding landscapes and having alliances that can be built across cultures to manage those, and then perhaps use them in activities that are either cultural or tourist, or do actually provide the basis for tourism, or all sorts of other things. Yes, we do, and that's a fantastic place to be looking for them. Do we have opportunities in things like solar fields or using geothermal, which of course there's plenty of around in inland Australia? Yes, we do, but we have to think about how you integrate that into a grid that might provide value to the nation more generally, as well as to the local area. So there's a whole raft of things there, which I invite people in the audience to be talking about over the next little while, about what are the things we're good at, which we can actually focus in on and actually try and build on to create some of those longer term proactive solutions. Because my vision for Central Australia is firstly one which is well respected and understood by city folk, even when they're voting and politicians are responding to just the local things, which are where all the people live. They nonetheless actually want to see this hinterland functioning well. And then it will be doing that by demonstrating the value and the ability of doing things with local knowledge and the local comparative advantage that we have in various areas in a way which is really recognised and respected around the world. And thirdly, we're actually making alliances across cultures and across regions, right across the world, in fact, into regions with similar issues, and really engaging in the opportunities that we have in this interconnected world to make that work well.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks to all our panellists for your vision. So now's the time for you guys to ask questions. So just raise your hand if you'd like, and we've got the microphone there that we can bring around to you. So if you've got a question for any of our panellists or for all of them, then this is the time to put your hand up, and I think we've got a question at the back there.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Yes, I've only come in recently here, but it's been raised before. Carl would know about this, about the need for a truth commission in Australia, about the truth being told, mainly by the mining industry, which is on the rampage at the moment, because the city folk are getting the message. Wherever mining goes, they've got a picture of the gentleman leaning down with a small plant. We are growing the environment. Sustainability is our thing. And they are winning this battle. They've got the money to win this battle. And unfortunately, in the centres away from Alice Springs, they're winning the battle. The hearts and minds of the middle people who don't really think about it. But they have the image of the plants growing, and we're here for the long haul, Santos and all those companies, and about sustainability. They've taken our verbiage, they've taken everything else. It's about time a truth commission was established by the community. The parliamentarians won't do it, but a truth commission made up from the community to say, these guys are lying, pick 2 or 3 every month. Santos, liars, because if you take the mineral from the ground, it's a negative. There is negative. You're doing something with it. It's not about sustainability, it's not about growth, but let's have some truth.
Okay.
Thank you.
Dr. Carl, to you, what do you think about the idea of a truth commission?
In China, if you now try to go onto their version of Google and type in truth, you will not get an answer, because there have been a few cases where the sons and daughters of wealthy Communist Party officials have driven their cars into crowds of people and killed a few and got off. And so there are people who've been asking, give us the truth about such and such. There is no truth in China at the moment. And then you go back to Australia and you try to find the hard truth there. That's really hard. I don't know how to do it. All I can suggest is that Mark and I had a little conversation the other day about where the governments should be going with long term. And you happy to take it on there, Mark? I mean, this is a really hard one. Because we don't have the governments in there for the long term. And with journalists, I'll just finish off on one thing. Has anybody in this room heard about the recent kerfuffle in the newspapers and the media around the world about how Apple iPhones, Foxconn factory, Chinese workers suicide? Anybody heard that? Yeah, okay, right. As soon as I heard that, I thought, wow, that's interesting. How high is the suicide rate? And I went and did the numbers, and it turns out that the workers at the Foxconn factory are committing suicide at 1/10 of the background Chinese suicide rate. They're actually committing suicide less often. They're happier than the average Chinese, but they're still committing suicide. And all you got in the newspapers was that the workers are committing suicide. So if your standard of journalism is that low, that they can't even do a fact check, What else? What have we got? Over to you, Dr.
Okay,
Mark.
let's not get in. Let's have a hard time with journalists, but that's all right. Mark, you can carry on.
Well, yeah, just so quickly, what we were talking about yesterday was the idea that actually, notwithstanding the occasional rogue trader or whatever, by and large, our companies are operating by the rules that we've set up for them to do, which is pretty short-termism and delivering to shareholders and things like that. That's no excuse for doing unethical behaviour and so on, but nonetheless, that's essentially what they're doing. Equally, our governments, which are sort of the second leg of the stool, well, they used to, as Dr. Carl mentioned earlier on, they used to have much more at least a 3, 4, 5 year electoral cycle viewpoint. These days, quite often, it's a much shorter news cycle sort of time, and there's a very intimate relationship between the news, big business, and politics in that regard. And I'll leave Dr. Carl to elaborate on that in detail. But what it suggests, and there is this interesting book, Capitalism 3.0, which just suggests it's about time we fixed up our operating system. And we need to upgrade from 2 to 3, which hopefully isn't quite the same as I've just had upgrading to Windows 7. But anyway, and the idea there is actually to introduce a third leg to the stool, which is a component which has a very long-term view, and it's long-term capital trust funds that really have a view, a bit like our superannuation funds, but they don't operate quite like this in practice. That says we actually want to take the 10, 20, 30 year viewpoint on this. And there is one in existence. It's called the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is quite an interesting thing to look up and Google if you like, which does that very well. And those then end up investing back in business and influencing government and pushing timeframes out. So I think we do need to think about that sort of thing. And I mean, one suggestion that has been floating around in Central Australia, for example, is the idea of an outback capital trust fund, where you might put some of your mining royalties into that, with a specific view on the long-term rebuilding the capital, social capital, human capital, environmental capital in these regions, and that's an idea that's worth pursuing.
Another question? Just raise your hand. We'll bring the mic to you. If you can just say your name when you ask the question, that'd be great.
Hi, my name's Jay. I've got a question about concentrated solar thermal power plants in Australia. I looked it up on the internet some time ago, and I can't remember where, but there's one station next door to a coal-fired power plant in New South Wales somewhere, and the other one, as I know it, was given by the government recently to the CSIRO, and I'm just wondering, under some sort of program that's connected with, I mean, Dr. Carl probably knows it, but I can't remember the name of it.
That's okay. No, yeah.
And I'm just wondering, there was supposed to be, I don't remember any of these figures because this is just off the cuff, but there was supposed to be so many billions of dollars that were set aside by the current government for those sorts of things. They gave one to the CSIRO. Where are all the rest, and what's the prospect?
Lyndon, you probably have some insight into this, do you?
And also, how are those power plants going, and why haven't we built any more?
They're a series of very good questions. So what you're talking about is the Solar Flagships program. A bit of background, the Australian government with CSIRO and a few others had spent about 3 years developing what came to be known as the Carbon Capture and Storage Flagship program. And it was a reasonably well thought out process of scientific research and modelling and testing and demonstration. 3 nights before the budget was released in 2009, it was queried, or a query came through Rudd's office as to why we weren't doing anything with solar, and within 3 days we had a $2 billion carbon capture and storage flagship program, and we also had a $2 billion solar flagships program. So the flagships program, while it was great that the money was allocated to it, was premised on the idea of doing something really big and really quickly. And the aim was to give about, over a number of years, give $2 billion to large-scale solar PV and large-scale solar thermal. By the 2010 budget, it was down to $1 billion, and by last 2011, it was $500 million within the forward estimates, and $500 million out to 7 years. So it was rapidly changed from being flagship to smaller flag boat sort of scale program. There was the intention was basically to build the single biggest PV plant in the world and the biggest single solar thermal plant in the world in one hit. And to date, and at the point where they were being proposed, the largest PV system in Australia was actually here in Alice Springs. So you're talking about a order of magnitude of about 160 times larger than what was actually in existence in Australia. That went to market. Boston Consulting were paid $1.6 million to go and work out how to ask solar suppliers around the country to put forward a bid. And you might notice a little bit of cynicism and bitterness about this whole process. And a number of the existing solar companies around Australia, including the preeminent expert on solar thermal, a guy called Keith Lovegrove out of ANU, and ourselves and a few others were invited to put forward proposals or to assess some of the proposals. We were informed by the Australian government that none of us were big enough or expert enough, so they imported a bunch of experts from Spain and US to assess all the proposals. The proposals were assessed. Areva, which was utilising Australian technology with linear Fresnel mirrors. I won't explain what it is, but it's basically mirrors and concentrates and heats water, and that was going to be over in New South Wales, southern Queensland, and the Moree solar plant, which was going to be with BP Solar. BP Solar's since gone bust, and globally, we were just discussing with Carl yesterday, BP Solar no longer exists as a company in its entirety anywhere in the world, and Areva can't get finance. And so what's happening at the moment is that many of the suggestions that were made very early on in the establishment of the program are now being revisited, and it's looking like what we'll see is Flagships 2.0, which will be smaller, 5 to 30 megawatt size power plants and allowed to be included on fringe of grid, which raises an exciting potential for the Northern Territory, because up until now the Northern Territory have been explicitly excluded from being involved in any of the Flagships projects. That's a potted history of it. Sort of. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's good. Thank you. Yeah. And Lyndon, out of interest, because I mean you do a lot of work and travel around the globe. How do you see interest in and development in solar projects overseas compared to Australia now? Because I think we often like to think of ourselves as leading the way when it comes to solar energy. But is that the case from your travels?
Look, certainly. From sheer numbers, Australia's lagging. We're well behind where we should be as far as just the scale of the plants that actually currently exist.
We don't have much sun, so that's,
If you imagine, how many of you have spent any time in southwest Tasmania? Okay, well, if any of you Tasmanians, right, well, I'm going to offend you now. Everyone who's spent time in southwest Tasmania knows it's cold and wet and bloody miserable. The important thing to note is that corner of Tasmania gets less sunshine than anywhere else in Australia and still gets more sunshine than Germany. And Germany's got hit for the first time about 8-9 weeks ago. For the first time, in the middle of the day, 50% of its entire energy in the entire country of Germany was being powered by solar within that country. So 50 for about 1 hour in the middle of the day was a Friday. By memory, I can't remember the date. It was mid-June, some period.
For one period of time.
For one period of time, 50% of the entire energy consumption in Germany was being sourced from solar PV.
Wow.
So the short answer is yes, solar PV can actually get there, and Australia has a big future in it. The interesting part about Australia is that the household PV market in Australia is actually currently regarded by most. And if you look at global commodity prices on silicon and number of key indices that drive PV development, what you're actually seeing is that Australia is regarded as a preeminent market for household PV. In fact, it's regarded as the first market in the world, that will have a standalone PV market without any additional subsidies. This is in a country which has got Newman, who's cut back his subsidies in Queensland, Bailey, who's done it in Victoria. They're ramping them down in South Australia with some modicum of common sense, and they've ripped the heart out of it in New South Wales, and the PV market's still going ahead. So Australia in that context is a fascinating insight into how householders, are materially changing their perception of energy and how they relate to it. On the commercial scale, we've got a long way to go. Alice Springs is a world leader. we have people around the world who come and look at what we do for the knowledge and the learning around how we're applying it. One of the interesting things about the Alice Springs grid, it's big enough to matter, but it's small enough that you can tinker with, and it provides a very rare occurrence to be able to do things like play and test things. And so we've actually got current projects with CSIRO and NREL in Colorado, which are utilising data from Alice Springs for broad research.
And just finally, how long until Australia can be like Germany and have 50% of our power coming from solar? What's the time frame?
Look,
It's not good.
I would say that by 2030, I genuinely think that materially the energy network will be different. The reality is that, and this is where understanding renewables and understanding sustainability actually have to get your head around the global commodities markets and global liquid fuels market. We in the NT have a 20-year gas contract that purchases cheap gas from the Blacktip gas plant via ConocoPhillips. And based on forward projections of natural gas prices going around, we will be paying probably about what half the market rate is for natural gas. And ConocoPhillips, if they've got half a brain in 20 years or in 15 years' time, will turn around and sell that gas on global markets. The impact of that is it'll either drive rapid change by governments to come up with more secure energy strategies, and solar thermal and solar PV are part of that, or they'll secure natural gas sources and other supplies, but it'll actually see our household energy prices climb. And the impact of that is that people will do what is already starting to happen, is people will just disconnect from the grid. They'll start actually doing household storage, and they'll make their own mind. And so the power of individual households to rapidly transform their engagement with energy is going to really shape how the energy market works.
Anthony, did you want to add to that?
Oh, yes, that was very cheeky of me. But when I was amazed when Carl was talking about, put up those maps of what the old grid, the old infrastructure, the old engineering energy grid in America looks like, and the new grid that they're currently investing in. Because if that's in America, and that's happening in the GFC, and it's the next Roosevelt big, it's the next 1930s. You do grand, forward-thinking big projects when the economy's down. That's what Keynes told us, and America's doing it. Isn't that great? One of the things that's going on in Australia, certainly, I live in Sydney, and there's just this, panic about power prices, and so it's almost, and everyone, and the easy default is to think, oh, it's the carbon tax. People in the engineering sector know that Australia's, our infrastructure, our power generating infrastructure and our power distribution grid is desperately old. It's time for, a lot of the power pricing issues are to do with the market not being privatised so that they can get investment to renew these desperately old plants and facilities that are not keeping up with capacity. So we're at a really good turning point, hopefully a tipping point, where they can leverage exactly what Lyndon was just saying, that the time to shift the type of infrastructure and how we think about it is perhaps economically upon us now, quite so. Does that
Yeah, and probably one demographical thing that I'd add to that is that we've had 100 years of refining the energy grid that we've got. That in mid-1990s, Melbourne University shut down their power engineering course because the view was that there was nothing more to be learnt about the power sector. I'm serious, I was enrolled and I was the last student enrolled. I had to go and do subjects at Monash and drive across town. And so it was a genuine view that there was nothing more to learn. And so what you've got right now is a generation, now I've upset the Tasmanians, I'm going to upset anyone who's older than 55. There's a generation of energy planners, engineers, policy makers who are probably 55 now, mid to late 50s, who were trained in, I don't know, when was that, the 70s, early 80s, and they had a view of the world which was coal, it was big power lines, it was big power stations. And they're not the people who need to be driving decision maker, and demographically they're heading towards a retirement, and you're asking them to suddenly rethink their entire career and everything they've learned. So to a certain extent, demographics will actually win the debate. The guys who are going to uni now, the graduate students that are coming and working for us, in 20 years' time when they're making the decisions, it's just they've gone through an entire education system that says, no, you need to think differently. And I think that actually adds an element of positivism.
I think we had a question down the front there. We'll get to in just a moment. Mark, did you want to briefly just have the final word on this?
Well, yeah, just a very quick comment, just to endorse Anthony's point that I think the issue here is having nation-building vision rather than getting just the right precise economics thing. Because I mean, whatever you say about the NBN and things like that, it's clearly something we have to have that sort of connectivity, and the same sort of thing is true for energy. And in terms of the town here in Central Australia, I mean, there are opportunities within Alice Springs as a grid itself to be a world leader. But if you take the bigger vision, I think it is actually that Australia supplies energy into Asia and contributes to reducing the tensions around dams on the Mekong and all sorts of things like that, which all sound a bit airy-fairy, but actually are a much bigger regional nation and in fact sub-global building exercise, which actually gives an opportunity for a lot of these energy things not just to be southeastern Australia grids, but to actually come through Alice Springs and go through to the north. Potentially power aluminium smelting on the way rather than sending it all to New Zealand and doing it on cleaner energy there, which has all sorts of transport costs, allows us to do more processing here, and then takes it into Asia and actually tries to alleviate some of the potential future stresses in our own region there. I mean, there's a bigger geopolitical picture here, which is actually really interesting, and one which I think Alice Springs ought to be articulating.
Hi, my name's Peachy and I work at the Airlands Environment Centre, and I had a question for Veronica and Harold. And I guess when I think of the challenges and opportunities that face Central Australia in particular, the challenges, to me it's one of the main issues is the sheer disadvantage and imbalances that exist between our Indigenous and non-Indigenous people here. And I guess I wanted to ask you guys your thoughts on that, how we can move together forward on that issue and ways that we can all support that process.
Harold, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I'll kick off. We hear all the words about empowerment and so forth, but one of the basic issues that people don't get empowered if decisions are made elsewhere. It doesn't matter who you are, where you are. People need to be in control of their own lives, as basic as going down shopping and whatever else. So whilst decision making and control is exercised remotely, say from Canberra, Darwin or wherever else, in remote places, then it's going to be a difficult problem to empower people across remote Australia. I think that's number one issue that needs to be dealt with. It needs to be faced, and people need to have the right and feel that they have the right and the confidence to be able to say these things and have that real discussion about it without being knocked down and knocked over the head whenever they put their head up. So that's number one. It's got to be a real discussion. It's got to be fair dinkum. You can't have fly in, fly outs, a government or otherwise telling us what to do, what not to do, and whatever else. But I think that's one of the crucial issues. No people in the world can survive, but live in a decent sort of way while power and control is exercised elsewhere.
And Harold, do you see much of what you're talking about happening? I mean, is there much? Well, I guess is there too much of a fly in, fly out culture and a top-down approach?
It's basically a top-down approach, yes. I mean,
so do you see much of the opposite?
I think it's less now than it has been. Yeah, there's more and more control being exercised out of, possibly out of Darwin and from Canberra, for whatever good intentions the intervention was about. In the end, it's about decision making from Canberra.
Well, did you want to make a comment on this? I guess it's talking about working together and about getting that sense of empowerment in the Indigenous community.
Well, people are starting to do that anyway. Oh, sorry. People are doing that anyway because we started doing the IEK work, and I think it's going to continue to happen, and people looking forward to doing that because we've got problems with buffel grass and other foreign grasses, as well as Mexican poppies and things like that coming in and killing off all the bush foods and stuff like that that people have lived on for, you know, over 60,000 years, and a lot of the plants are disappearing. And I think it's got something to do with the environment problem, because of the other grasses and that coming in killing it off as well. Like the foods that people ate and other plants are disappearing, and not too sure how we're going to tackle it, but we're trying to do things about it now, and we have been all the time. And you know, as I say, like cattle and that got a lot to do with it as well. I think, you know, the problems we have with our waters, we've got springs, soaks and other waters, you know, like rock holes and that, they get damaged by, you know, feral animals, and a lot of them dry out when it's hot seasons, if we don't get rain and that. And yeah, I think it is a big problem, but we're trying to tackle it. Our people are trying to do things about their waters and things that are out there on the land, take care of the land as well.
Yeah, this is something I said at the a couple of years ago at the annual CRC conference, a panel discussion there. It seems that with the intervention, and it's a good example of government intervention, Commonwealth style, intervenes in people's lives, but it's goodwill. But what's happening is that with that goodwill of governments or whatever else, more and more of it, people are suffering, people are almost drowning, you can't get fresh air. And the person I was discussing this with said, well, what happens then? You can't get air, what happens? Well, you die. So I said, well, I can't say that at a panel. You know, but it's that suffocating of goodwill. And you can't say, well, hang on, stop doing that, because people get offended. They say, well, we're doing this for your good, or so-and-so's good. But there's so much of it. It's just not giving people the opportunity to live almost normal lives with the pain of the difficulty of sometimes learning to live. I'll go into detail of one of my cousins that drove around town the other day. She asked me to take her around town, look for a vehicle. I thought she was driving, looking around for a friend or a relative. It was actually to purchase a vehicle. I didn't know. And she came back and said, well, I've got a vehicle, here's the paperwork. I said, what? You haven't driven it? You haven't even sat in it? Did you start it? And the paperwork was to take down to Centrelink. And somehow Centrelink was going to pay this car. Now, I don't know how that happened, or how it happens, but it's through the arrangements of presumably the basic card. I don't know. But I just said in the car, driving along to my car, the cousin, I said, well, what's this? This big brother, big sister, big mother? Centrelink. I mean, what has the world come, what have we come to? So, to me, that was a clear example of this almost smothering that people can't live their lives almost anymore. I guess that's what I mean.
Thanks, Harold. I think we had another question up the back there.
I'm an over 55 policymaker in education, you know, and I believe we've got a lot to offer, may I humbly suggest, because if education actually was worried about discernment, intellectual endeavour and rigour in the schools, we wouldn't need a truth commission, because the schools themselves would teach the students to be able to see poppycock on television and the media and everything else. So give us over 55s a bit of a go. And humbly apologise. Indeed, humbly apologise. But I also noticed that across Australia, with the change of government, there has been a cutback in some very significant sustainability environment programs. And I'd like to just ask each of the panel, do you think as a nation and as individual governments and political parties, we are really serious about climate change and doing something about it? Or is it just something we say more or less at election time, and then when when it's really hard and tough, it's one of the first things we simply cut off the budget?
All right. Well, as we've got so many questions in a limited time, we'll just get a couple of opinions on that. Firstly, to you, Dr. Carr, because you have had a foray into politics in the past.
Yes, with regard to education, I was with a bunch of school kids from my son's school coming back from the Himalayas, and we went into the airport in Bangkok, went to the group check-in, and there were all these giant young men, and I said I'd like to check in all these school kids, and she looked at these 2 metre tall men and said, are they school children? You know, thinking of little kids. I said yes, and she said, are you a school teacher? Well, I wasn't, but I've been there to help, and I ended up taking over in some way because of a medical problem. And to make it easy, I said yes. And she said, oh, you're a school teacher. In that case, I'll see if I can upgrade you to business class. And she did.
Wow.
Now, there's only a few countries in the world where we value education. There are a few countries in Asia and the Scandinavian countries. Everywhere else sees education as something to be taxed to make money for consolidated revenue. I was talking with Brian Schmidt, the Australian Nobel Prize winner, and I said, what do you think helped? And he said, when I was a kid, we were talking about the Alaska Fund, there was lots of money from oil, so all the teachers were really, really good. And as a result, that 12 years of investment in me is paying off with 50 years return. And that's how we should see education.
And so what do we all say when we go to Qantas next time? As we go on? I'm a school teacher, business class.
No, it only works with Asian airlines.
Oh, right. AirAsia. Anthea, do you want to just make a comment about that one as well, and about how much actually political engagement there is in the sustainable technology and so forth?
Oh, I just think that the commitment is not commensurate with the order of magnitude of the change that we need, and the timeframes are too short, and so you just get this opportunistic, opportunistic policy making and watered down things. I mean, I was amazed that the mining tax was not linked to action on climate change. I mean, whether it's a capital trust fund or a sovereign wealth fund like Norway has from all their mineral resources, that they can then invest in education and in climate change initiatives, So no, I mean, how do you get the tenor of public debate to get the big picture issues up there for long enough? It's really, really hard. And it's really, really hard in an ageing population where people get a little bit more conservative and are more likely to vote in a particular way. Apologies in advance.
All right. Just really quickly, then, right? Yeah.
I think fundamentally the problem with climate change, to quote Tony Abbott, is that climate change is a python squeeze, not a cobra strike. And it's just going to take a long time for people to respond. And if you're trying to convince mum and dad with 3 kids that they should worry about changing their energy consumption at a point where they're worrying about whether they can pay their school fees next month, it's just a difficult sell. And we've got a whole coterie of politicians who've got very good at speaking to that particular demographic.
What are some of the innovative thinking and visions that are happening for remote communities in terms of housing and transport infrastructure that local thinking is bringing together?
Yeah, okay.
Well, housing, yeah, out at Santa Teresa, I can only talk about Santa Teresa, yeah. There's a lot of housing because of the elections, I think. There was
some more elections.
There was talk about the housing out on communities like Santa Teresa and that. It only happened on Wednesday actually, about the housing. So You know,
And how many weeks out from election are we? Just a
I
couple of
think
weeks.
it's because of that, yeah. It's normally the case when the elections are in the air, you know, people talk about this and that, and I think, you know, I'm not too sure whether
All right, no problem. Thank you,
that'll
Veronica.
happen or not, but anyway.
Harold, do you want to just quickly comment on that?
Yeah, look, some groups around the territory and elsewhere, I guess, are looking at alternative ways of trying to build housing. East Arnhem Land people have decided they'll do what people used to do years ago, and I actually grew up in houses up in the north there, built from cypress pine, cut from the bush up there and milled and so forth on the coast there and shipped along the coast to where the mission I was at, and I grew up in one of those houses. So there's an idea going around, and they're actually implementing it, that they're building houses and other infrastructure utilising local timber. That's happening in East Arnhem Land. I understand that there's a push again on in the Utopia region to do likewise, but maybe using other alternative uses of material. This comes up quite often, it comes around in circles. Many people feel constrained to a certain extent by use of, by the government, I guess, lease arrangements for housing, and people getting caught up in the housing stuff. So there's two sides to it. You know, people want decent housing, but there's in outstations and so forth, it's difficult to get that because you can't necessarily deliver the same standard, if you like, of mainstream housing. And so people looking at alternatives, but it just goes around in circles, basically.
Thanks, Harold. Just maybe two more questions, just quickly to finish us off this afternoon. Yeah, one at the back there.
While we all want bigger houses, nicer houses, we all want our own place, rah. What about global population control? Like, we all have such a short water source, like can't be around forever. We're running out of water as it is around the world. We're running out of food around the world. We can't just all grow our own veggies and everything.
Why not?
So what are some ideas about global scale population control? Because we all want a family, we all want grandkids, rah, it's great. But our Earth just can't hold a lot of us.
Thank you. So, Dr. Carl, contraception.
Number one, around September each year, we get to the stage where we've used up all of the sustainable resources to run the planet for that calendar year. And that's on a population of 7 billion. Number two, the population will get to, best estimate, 9 billion. Nobel Prize winner talks about this, lots of papers on this, and then begin to fall down of itself. The population will drop, but it will get up to 9 billion. I'm just hopeful that it will go up and then go down. I hope we don't have any wars or nasty things like that to make it go down. They're nasty. Don't like that.
Yeah, Mark.
Could I just add to that? I mean, two things. I mean, one is we talk a lot about population, but actually population is not the critical issue. As Carl says, we can see the potential end to the population per se problem, that it might actually peak at about 9 to 10 billion. And that's nothing like the same problem as consumption. It's actually consumption, the amount we consume, that's the problem. Because if everyone in the world just increases their consumption by 20%, which is actually going to happen very quickly over the next decade or so, it'll have a bigger impact than all of that extra population. So we should be thinking a lot more about consumption is the first point. And the second point, just to link back to the comment earlier about how do we get governments to think more about this. I mean, there are short-term things, and we touched on those a bit. But if you want to think about the really long term, because I think we have to do that, because it's not just going to spontaneously happen otherwise, in the long term we have to start really thinking about different measures of well-being. So we've just got to stop measuring things by GDP, which we know is not actually a particularly valuable thing. People don't feel better for having more GDP. You feel better for how you're doing compared to other people around you. And we really need to get some other measures of well-being, not just, and they're things which have to come in and they have to be operationalised and used on TV and things like that for a decade or two before people really start changing their deep feelings about consumption, basically, which is the real challenge.
Final question. Have we got one more that we can go to just at the end?
G'day. I just wanted to talk about if you knew much about a resource-based economy. Our whole economic system is nearing collapse. We're desperately running out of resources. We're consuming more than we ever had on the planet. I was wondering if you'd given any consideration to a complete transformation of the way we live and move away from money and start looking at an economy based around our resources and the clever use of them. Stop living this illusion and doing jobs that we don't like for this substance that we don't really need.
This is good. This is a light, short question to finish. Yeah, Carl.
Okay, when I was a kid and even recently reading science fiction, what was going to happen was that there'd be these robots and computers, and we'd have so much spare time that we'd have to go to Tech, TAFE and university to know how to spend our spare time. What's happened instead is that we're all working longer, we don't have the weekends anymore, we got ripped off, I'm with you.
All right, Mark, did you want to make a comment on this?
Yeah, I'll just comment that there's a fantastic book called Prosperity Without Growth, which is well worth a read on exactly this topic, because it actually takes the standard economic model and says, well, how could you make it work without what we think of as growth today? And it's actually about growth in well-being instead of growth in GDP. And a lot of it is actually around the sorts of it comes right back to talking about what Veronica was talking about earlier on, which is coming back to valuing activities which are actually not carbon intensive and resource intensive in a whole lot of ways. It's things like the people who actually do yoga for everyone. That doesn't actually chew up a lot of resources, but it gives a lot of satisfaction. It comes back to looking after things on country and valuing culture in that sort of way. So again, I mean, I'm not utopian here. This isn't going to happen overnight. But you can actually see the building blocks, and this guy, Peter Jackson, who wrote Peter Jackson, that sounds like a film person. It's something like that. Anyway, look up Prosperity Without Growth. And he really does actually try and go through the steps that you might need to try and encourage. And they're things that we should all be thinking about in our day-to-day lives, I think.
Mm-hmm. Harold, have you got a thought on this? I guess moving away from, as he was saying, mining and using the resources indicating growth, can we sort of shift that?
Well, I'm not too sure if we can. We're so entrenched. But I agree that there must be a better way of living than going 9 to 5 to work and so forth.
Round of applause for that.
Right? Yeah. There must be a better way. Just continue digging holes in the ground, or those trucks going 24 hours a day. Yeah, alternative ways of living. I agree with that.
Anthea?
Oh gosh, two-speed economy. I think you've got to. We are at a two-speed economy. We're so entrenched with mining in the foreseeable future. It'll be very tricky to think other than in those sort of mainstream economic terms in the mainstream debate. But I think there are two streams, and there's more and more people participating in the second stream, which is about sustainability, which is about social capital, which is about thinking about social enterprise and demanding social and ethical behaviour from corporates and so on and so forth. And I think Carl was saying, various speakers have talked about what's unique about Alice Springs. I think anyone who lives here is really, really lucky. You are in the hot seat, if you like, of somewhere where you've got two different worldviews living side by side. And if you can't make some really clever, sustainable, sustainably, socially innovative things happen that can help you opt out of the sort of mainstream economic, drag. I don't know where else you can do it. I mean, there's lots of drivers for why you need to do it here, and there's a lot of cultural richness here to help make it happen. Things like people like Harold and the local people who've been here forever, and things like the social enterprise hub at Desert Knowledge, and all the great things happening here.
Yeah. And I reckon that's a good place to finish. So thank you very much. Thank you to our panel, Lyndon Friss and Anthea Fawcett, Harold Ferber, Dr. Carl Krusnitsky, Veronica Dobson and Dr. Mark Stachetsky.